Carrier strike groups usually arrive late, after signals have failed, after escalation has already hardened. What makes this case different is not the deployment itself, but the timing. In the Persian Gulf, geography collapses reaction time. Everything funnels toward a narrow maritime system where delay carries consequences before decisions are finalized. The rush of a U.S. carrier was not about headlines or posturing. It was about systems moving faster than policy. Routes, surveillance layers, energy flows, and alliance expectations converged at once. The familiar explanations only describe the surface. The real drivers sit underneath where options quietly disappear. This analysis moves step by step through those pressures. Each one narrows the next. The final reason is not obvious, but it is decisive. By the end of this video, you'll understand why. The Persian Gulf does not allow waiting. Once pressure builds, geography removes the option of delay. The Strait of Hormuz is not just narrow, it compresses time. Shipping lanes, patrol routes, and surveillance coverage overlap in a way that shortens every decision cycle. As commercial traffic increases, so does visibility. Movements are detected early, interpreted quickly, and reacted to before diplomacy adjusts. This is where pressure begins forming rather than exploding. Command timelines lag behind physical reality. A pause occurs here. The assumption that distance creates safety quietly fails. With limited maneuver space, hesitation carries its own signal. The longer a response takes, the less credible it becomes. Not reach, position. Once that position is unoccupied, alternatives narrow. Naval reassurance, market stability, and deterrence all become conditional. This is the first structural fracture. Geography doesn't escalate conflict. It removes flexibility. What happens when only one platform can still arrive in time? Global War's timeline, a long-form geopolitical analysis, grounded in real history. The constraint wasn't force, it was availability. Carrier strike groups are not interchangeable pieces waiting on a board. They rotate through maintenance cycles, crew rest, and regional tasking that limits who can move and when. As pressure rose in the Gulf, most alternatives were already spoken for. The USS Abraham Lincoln was positioned differently, not closer in distance, but closer in readiness. That distinction matters. Timing narrowed the choice set before any public decision appeared to be made. Here the logic tightens. Waiting for another carrier would not preserve options. It would erase them. Deployment windows close faster than political calendars acknowledge. A quiet failure sits underneath this moment. The belief that presence can always be generated on demand proves false. Not strength, availability. Once that window began closing, non-action stopped being neutral. The system forced a single viable move. Availability solves one problem until surveillance compresses it further. Every movement in the Gulf is seen early. Coastal radar sites, maritime patrol aircraft, drones, and satellite coverage layer the region with persistent visibility. Nothing large enters unnoticed. That reality reshapes escalation long before weapons are involved. This creates a contradiction. Delaying a deployment does not reduce tension, it increases uncertainty. Absence is interpreted as intent just as quickly as presence. Signals travel faster than explanations. Midway through this logic, another assumption fails. Secrecy no longer buffers decision-making. Once movement becomes visible, timelines compress. Responses begin forming before orders are finalized. Options narrow quietly. Ambiguity collapses. Physical presence becomes the only stabilizing signal left, not concealment. Inevitability. In a region where detection precedes diplomacy, control depends on matching visibility with posture. Visibility doesn't just affect militaries, it moves markets next. Before any clash, prices react. The Persian Gulf's tanker lanes carry expectations as much as crude. When pressure concentrates near the Strait of Hormuz, markets do not wait for confirmation. They anticipate disruption. Insurance premiums rise, futures shift. Governments notice. This is where economic pressure enters the system. Export terminals along the Gulf and bypass routes toward Fujairah become reference points for risk, not capacity. Even without interruption, volatility spreads outward. There is a pause here. The belief that economics follow security quietly reverses. Once traders begin pricing uncertainty, political leaders lose time. Delay no longer preserves flexibility, it multiplies cost. Reassurance becomes a requirement, not a preference. Naval presence shifts from deterrence to stabilization, not conflict, expectation. As markets react faster than ministries, options narrow. Waiting deepens exposure, and exposure forces movement. Economic reassurance pulls allies into the equation. Alliances respond to silence faster than to statements. In the Gulf, reassurance is measured in presence, not press releases. Forward bases, shared ports, and joint patrol corridors turn uncertainty into something visible. When those signals lag, confidence begins to thin. This pressure forms quietly. Partners watch timelines, not intentions. Delay invites hedging. Small adjustments follow, logistics rerouted, messaging softened, contingency planning widened. None of it is dramatic, all of it matters. There is a pause here. The assumption that allies will wait proves fragile. Once doubt spreads, coordination becomes harder to recover. Every day without movement increases the cost of later action. Collective posture starts to fracture into individual risk management. Not unity, credibility. When reassurance depends on timing, hesitation narrows diplomatic space. Presence becomes the only language that stabilizes expectations. Credibility demands more than reassurance. It demands physical control. Escalation did not arrive as a single event. It accumulated through routine friction. Small naval units operating near shipping lanes, inspections, and close approaches stayed below the threshold of open conflict while steadily raising risk. Each action was limited. Together, they compressed tolerance. This creates a dilemma. Respond too strongly and escalation accelerates. Respond too slowly and the behavior normalizes. The Gulf magnifies this tension because proximity collapses reaction time. Small moves generate large consequences. A pause emerges here. The belief that restraint automatically de-escalates begins to fail. Once repeated actions go unanswered, expectations shift. What was once exceptional becomes acceptable. Control erodes without a decisive moment to mark the boundary. Not war, momentum. As gray zone pressure accumulates, options narrow toward presence as the only stabilizer. Delay no longer preserves calm. It invites repetition. Geography turns minor actions into system-wide risk. Maritime traffic in the Gulf does not disperse evenly. It funnels. Narrow transit corridors near the Strait of Hormuz concentrate tankers, escorts, and patrols into predictable paths. Geography dictates where movement must pass, regardless of intent. This constraint changes everything. Predictability increases exposure. Alternatives exist on paper, but not in volume or speed. When pressure builds, dispersion becomes theoretical. There is a pause here. The assumption that routes can be flexibly adjusted breaks down. Once traffic concentrates, protection must concentrate with it. Coverage gaps carry immediate consequences. Presence cannot be symbolic, it must sit directly on the funnel. Not coverage, concentration. As routes tighten, strategic choice narrows. Control shifts from regional dominance to corridor management. Waiting elsewhere no longer matters. Concentration demands constant monitoring, not occasional attention. Forward presence in the Gulf is less about warning than management. Once routes concentrate and tolerance narrows, deterrence alone stops working. What matters is control over timing. Carrier-based air coverage extends response windows just enough to prevent miscalculation from cascading. This is where distance becomes a liability. Assets held back cannot intervene quickly enough to shape events as they unfold. Reaction shifts from planned to improvised. The system begins running ahead of decision makers. A pause appears here. The assumption that escalation is avoided by staying back no longer holds. Control is not dominance, it is endurance. The ability to remain, observe, and respond without crossing thresholds. As reaction time shrinks, only sustained presence preserves options. Everything else introduces delay, not power, control. In compressed environments, stability depends on who can stay engaged longest. Control stabilizes more than ships, it steadies economies. Strategic pressure does not pause for political schedules. Decision-making slows precisely when environments accelerate. Authorization chains lengthen. Messaging is debated. Risk tolerance shifts. None of this aligns with the pace of events in the Persian Gulf. This creates a limitation. As electoral calendars, legislative scrutiny, and alliance consultations absorb attention, the system outside keeps moving. Shipping continues. Surveillance persists. Incidents accumulate. There is a pause here. The belief that time remains neutral collapses. Delay becomes irreversible faster than expected. Once uncertainty hardens, later action appears reactive rather than stabilizing. Options narrow quietly, not through crisis, but through missed windows, not debate. Deadline. When political time lags behind strategic compression, early movement preserves choice. Waiting converts discretion into obligation. When all pressures converge, the system leaves no alternative. By the time the carrier moved, the decision was no longer discretionary. Geography had compressed timelines. Surveillance had eliminated ambiguity. Markets had priced instability. Alliances had begun recalculating. Political delay carried more risk than action. Each system narrowed the next. This is the deepest truth. The deployment was not driven by escalation intent, but by constraint accumulation. Power shifted from choice to obligation, not command. Convergence. Once reaction time shrinks far enough, strategy stops shaping events and starts preventing collapse. Presence becomes less about signaling and more about preserving what little flexibility remains. The carrier did not create the moment. It arrived because the moment had already formed. The long-term consequence is precedent. Speed replaces scale. Timing replaces mass. Future crises will be managed earlier, not because leaders prefer it, but because systems demand it. This is how modern confrontation now unfolds, before conflict, not during it. Global War's timeline, long-form geopolitical analysis grounded in real history.